My family has worked this land for 3 generations. It's not just a piece of property, it's our heritage, our legacy. But when I saw the HOA president marching up to my fence that morning, demanding I remove my cows for lowering property values, I knew something was off. Little did I know, my security cameras would capture a midnight scheme that would expose everything. Stick around to see how I taught this power-hungry HOA a lesson they'll never forget. Back in 1947, my grandfather bought this land with everything he had saved up from the war. I still remember him telling me stories about how he built every fence post by hand, working from sunrise to sunset. This wasn't just any piece of land. It was his American dream. He passed it down to my father, who taught me everything I know about farming, caring for the animals, and doing things the right way. For decades, it was just us and a few other farming families out here. But then, about 2 years ago, everything started to change. Fancy developments began popping up, million-dollar homes with their manicured lawns, just a stone's throw from where my cows graze. At first, we tried to be good neighbors. I even invited some of the new homeowners to our annual harvest barbecue. But then, last month, a certified letter showed up in my mailbox. The new HOA was demanding changes, claiming my cows were decreasing property values. Can you believe that? But what really got my attention was what my security cameras picked up that same night. 3 people with flashlights were sneaking around my property line, taking pictures. Something wasn't right, and I was about to find out just how deep this whole thing went. The very next morning, I was out checking the fence line when I saw her, Sarah Matthews, the new HOA president. She was stomping across my front pasture in her designer heels, with a thick folder under her arm and that look on her face, like she owned the place. Behind her were 2 board members, taking pictures and shaking their heads at my barn. I'll never forget how she started waving around some property maintenance ordinance, telling me my cows had to go within 30 days. Her voice was dripping with that condescending tone as she listed off violations. Apparently, my historic barn was an eyesore, and the morning sounds of farm life were disturbing the peace. But what she didn't expect was me pulling out those yellowed zoning documents my grandfather had kept all these years. Her face turned red when I showed her the big stamp marking this as protected agricultural land since 1943. I explained how my grandfather had the foresight to get these protections in place, knowing someday someone might try to push us out. That's when Tom Miller, our retired neighbor, came walking over. Turns out he wasn't just any retiree, he was a former county judge. He took one look at their documents and started laughing. He told me later about 2 other farmers just down the road who'd been pressured to sell their land recently. Something about his tone made me realize this wasn't just about my cows or property values. Later that evening, I got a call from Bill Thompson over at the Carson family farm. They'd gotten the same letter, the same demands. 3 generations of farming, just like us, and now they were being told their way of life was unsuitable for the neighborhood. But what these HOA folks didn't know was that they picked the wrong farmers to mess with. And I had a feeling Tom knew exactly what we needed to do next. I couldn't shake the feeling something bigger was going on, so I started reviewing my security camera footage from the past month. That's when I noticed something strange. Every Wednesday night, like clockwork, a black SUV would park at the end of my property. At first, I thought they were just teenagers looking for trouble, but then I zoomed in. It was Sarah Matthews and someone I'd never seen before, taking pictures and pointing at different parts of my land. But the real shock came when I was going through my mail. Those complaint letters the HOA kept sending, I started noticing something odd about the signatures. Mrs. Johnson from number 42, Mr. Peterson from the corner house. I knew these people. They'd always been friendly. So I showed up at Mrs. Johnson's door with one of these letters. Her face went pale. She never signed anything like that, never even heard about complaints against my farm. That's when Tom, our retired judge neighbor, connected me with Jack Wilson at the local newspaper. Jack had been investigating similar cases in neighboring counties. Farms that had been in families for generations, suddenly selling for pennies on the dollar after HOA pressure. He showed me a pattern, luxury developments popping up exactly where family farms used to be. One night, my doorbell rang. It was Linda, Sarah's assistant from the HOA office. She was shaking as she handed me an envelope. "I can't sleep at night knowing what they're planning," she whispered. Inside was a USB drive with recorded board meetings, emails, and a development plan I wasn't supposed to see. They weren't just targeting my farm. They had a hit list of every agricultural property in the county. The more I dug, the more pieces fell into place. Those late-night meetings, the fake complaints, the sudden pressure on all the local farmers, it was all part of something bigger. And when I finally connected all the dots, I realized this wasn't just about property values anymore. These people had no idea what they'd started, but they were about to find out exactly what happens when you mess with a farmer who's got truth on his side. I'll never forget that Sunday morning when I finally saw what was on that USB drive. There was Sarah Matthews in the HOA office, meeting with a man in an expensive suit, her husband, James Matthews, CEO of Sunrise Development Corporation. They were laughing, planning how they'd force out every farmer in the area. "Once those property values tank," he said, "we'll swoop in and buy everything for next to nothing." It hit me like a ton of bricks. The same company that had been buying up foreclosed farms across 3 counties was run by the HOA president's husband. Every complaint, every violation, every late-night inspection, it was all orchestrated to drive us out. They'd done this before, targeting family farms one by one, using HOA regulations as their weapon. The next recording showed Sarah mapping out their strategy. "Start with the Miller farm," she said. "Then pressure Thompson's place. Save the stubborn one with the cows for last." They even had a timeline drawn up for when each farm would be dealt with, but what made my blood boil was hearing them mock my grandfather's original deed. "Who cares about some old paper?" James laughed. "By the time they figure out what's happening, it'll be too late." I took everything to Tom, our retired judge neighbor. He spent hours going through those files, his face getting grimmer by the minute. "This is bigger than just harassment," he said. "They're manipulating property values, falsifying documents. This is criminal." That's when we discovered they'd already done this in 2 other communities, leaving devastated farmers in their wake. What these city slickers didn't understand was that out here, we stick together. Word spread fast among the farming families. Bill Thompson's daughter, a lawyer in the city, started looking into their previous developments. Every single one followed the same pattern. An HOA would suddenly get aggressive, farms would be forced to sell, and Sunrise Development would swoop in with their luxury homes. But this time was different. This time, they'd left a trail. And this old farmer wasn't about to let them destroy everything our families had built. The local news story broke on a Tuesday morning. "Local HOA caught in farmland scheme," the headline read, with pictures of my farm and copies of those fake complaint letters. You should have seen Sarah Matthews' face when she pulled into the HOA office that morning, reporters waiting at the door. But that was just the beginning. The emergency town hall that night changed everything. As farmers from across the county filled every seat, old Mr. Peterson, who'd supposedly complained about my farm, stood up with tears in his eyes. His father had lost their family farm to the same scheme 10 years ago. That's when 3 HOA board members shocked everyone by resigning on the spot. Mary Collins, one of them, handed over emails exposing Sarah's manipulation. "We were pressured to vote against farms," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't what we signed up for." But the real bombshell dropped when a state investigator walked in. Seems our little local story had caught some bigger attention. He explained they'd been tracking Sunrise Development's suspicious land deals across the state. All they needed was concrete evidence, and thanks to that USB drive and our security footage, they finally had it. You could hear a pin drop when he showed those surveillance photos of James Matthews meeting with county officials late at night. The same officials who'd been fast-tracking zoning changes for his developments. Right there in front of everyone, he announced they were launching a full investigation into both the HOA and Sunrise Development. Sarah and James weren't at that meeting, of course, but by midnight, their perfect little scheme was all over the evening news. Sometimes, justice comes in surprising ways, and watching their carefully planned manipulation crumble on live TV was just the beginning of what was coming their way. When we finally got our hands on Sunrise Development's master plan, it was worse than anyone imagined. Their sleek corporate presentation mapped out a 5-year strategy to transform our entire farming community into what they called premium lifestyle estates. Every single family farm was marked for acquisition. They'd been planning this for years. Their blueprint read like a war plan against rural America: infiltrate HOAs, create impossible regulations, drive down values, force distressed sales. My farm was tagged as a stubborn holdout requiring aggressive measures. Each family surrender was scheduled like clockwork. But here, where their plan backfired spectacularly. Remember Linda, the HOA assistant who gave me that USB drive? She'd been quietly collecting evidence for months: meeting recordings, emails between Sarah and corrupt zoning officials, even photos of cash changing hands in parking lots. When the state attorney general's office saw what we had, things moved fast. Then we found the smoking gun, a memo from James Matthews himself, bragging about how they'd modernized 3 other farming communities into luxury developments. These farmers are sitting on gold mines, he wrote. They just need the right motivation to sell. That motivation was systematic harassment, backed by corrupted HOA power and a network of shell companies stretching across 12 counties. But they never expected a small-town farmer with security cameras and a retired judge for a neighbor to bring their whole operation crashing down. They thought they could bully us into giving up our heritage. Instead, they'd exposed a corruption scheme that went far beyond our little community. That's when they showed their real colors. James Matthews himself walked onto my property one morning, flanked by 2 expensive-looking lawyers. He pulled out a checkbook right there in my front yard. "Name your price," he said, like everything has a price tag. "This development is happening whether you like it or not. You can either leave rich or leave broken." I just stood there, thinking about my grandfather's hands building these fences, my father teaching me to care for this land. The check he was offering had more zeros than I'd ever seen. But then I heard a truck door slam. Seems word had gotten around fast. Bill Thompson was there with his daughter, the lawyer. Then Tom, our retired judge neighbor, walked up. Within minutes, half the farming community had shown up. What happened next spread like wildfire on social media. Someone recorded the whole thing. The community standing together, Matthews trying to buy us off, and the moment his own wife, Sarah, walked up, looking like she'd seen a ghost. See, while he was trying to bribe me, that security footage of their late-night meetings was playing at the emergency county commissioners' meeting. Our community fundraiser the next week was something else. Families who'd lost their farms to Sunrise in other counties drove for hours to be there. Local businesses donated everything from food to legal services. Even city folks who bought those fancy new houses showed up to support us. Turns out, they'd moved here because they loved the idea of living near real farms, not another soulless development. The video of our confrontation hit national news. Reporters started digging into similar cases across the country. Other farming communities began checking their HOA connections to development companies. The movement was growing bigger than anything we could have imagined. But the real showdown came at that final HOA board meeting. We all showed up: farmers, locals, even some of those suburban folks who'd originally supported the HOA. One by one, we laid out the evidence: the fake complaints, the manipulated property values, the midnight meetings. Sarah and James sat there, watching their perfect plan fall apart as their own board members turned against them. By the time we finished, there wasn't a person in that room who didn't understand what was really at stake. This wasn't just about my cows or property values anymore. This was about protecting a way of life that was being threatened all across America. And standing there, surrounded by my neighbors, I knew we'd started something that couldn't be stopped with any size checkbook. When the state investigation findings hit, it wasn't just justice. It was vindication for every farmer who'd ever felt powerless against corporate greed. We'd uncovered one of the largest land grab schemes in state history: forged documents, manipulated values, bribes to officials, and a trail of destroyed farming families just like mine. I was in the barn when they came to arrest Sarah and James Matthews. All those designer suits and fancy cars couldn't protect them now. The charges read like a grocery list: conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, falsifying official documents. Those late-night meetings caught on my security cameras. They were the nail in the coffin. Every single one showed them plotting with officials who were supposed to be protecting our interests. The courthouse was packed for their arraignment. Farmers from 3 counties showed up, some who'd lost everything to their schemes, others who'd been next on their target list. When the judge, an old farmer's daughter herself, denied them bail, you could feel the justice in that room. But this was bigger than just 2 people getting caught. The investigation exposed their entire network. Sunrise Development was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind it were investment firms from big cities, all working to swallow up America's farmland through HOA manipulation. They perfected their technique across multiple states, always using the same playbook. We caught them with it. That's when our state representatives stepped in. They'd been watching this case closely, and now they had what they needed. New legislation was drafted, specifically designed to protect agricultural land from HOA overreach. They called it the Heritage Farm Protection Act, and I'm proud to say it all started because one stubborn farmer refused to move his cows. Local farmers gathered at my place the day we heard about the first guilty verdict. Bill Thompson brought his famous apple pie, and Tom, our retired judge neighbor, couldn't stop grinning. The state's attorney stood right where Sarah Matthews had first confronted me, announcing that Sunrise Development's assets would be frozen, their developments halted, and their victims would have a chance at justice. The national media picked up the story. Suddenly, our little community became a symbol of standing up to corporate bullying. Other farming communities started investigating their own HOAs, looking for similar patterns. What started with my security cameras had sparked a movement across the heartland. The collapse of Sunrise Development made headlines nationwide. Their entire house of cards came tumbling down, the shell companies, the fake investment funds, everything. But the real victory wasn't watching their empire crumble. It was seeing our community come back stronger than ever. Remember those HOA board members who resigned that night? They were replaced by people who actually care about our community. The new president, old Mrs. Johnson, who'd been falsely accused of complaining about my farm. The first thing she did was tear up those ridiculous regulations about agricultural properties. "This is farm country," she said, "and we're going to keep it that way." The Farm Protection Ordinance we fought for became a model for other communities. State representatives from across the country started calling, wanting to know how we'd done it. Our little victory sparked a movement, farmers working with their neighbors to protect their heritage, their way of life. Those luxury developments Sunrise had planned, the new owners turned them into something special. They worked with us local farmers to create what they called agricultural integrated communities. Instead of trying to hide the farms, they celebrated them. They even started a weekly farmers market right where Sarah Matthews had planned to build her clubhouse. "You should see my property now. Those cows they wanted gone. They're still here, grazing peacefully." But now, families from the new homes bring their kids to watch them, learning about where their food comes from. We even started an educational program with the local schools. Turns out, people actually want to live near real farms, not just another cookie-cutter development. The best part, those property values they were so worried about, they've gone up more than anyone expected. Turns out, having protected farmland and a strong community is worth more than any luxury development. Every morning, I walk my fence line, just like my grandfather did, and I see something he never could have imagined: a community that finally understands the true value of its farming heritage. As for Sarah and James Matthews, last I heard, they're facing serious time behind bars. But their biggest punishment might be knowing that their scheme didn't just fail, it backfired completely, making our farming community stronger than ever. You know, they tried to bully this old farmer off his land with their fancy paperwork and backroom deals. Instead, they united a community and changed state law. Now my cows aren't just livestock, they're a symbol of standing up to corruption. And those property values they were so worried about, they're higher than ever thanks to having real, honest farmers as neighbors. Sometimes the best view isn't a fancy golf course. It's a reminder of what makes America strong.